Historically, because my field of work is clinical psychology, so when Anangu indicate that they're distressed, they use these sort of kurumba, juni, liri or kata as to signify that stress, and then they use, so kurumba, if anyone or the Anangu would have picked it up yesterday, is in Paul's story, Tujana's story, is that he was carrying that kurumba, so trying to put that spirit back in place. Because that guy was sitting there deflated, kurumba wia, so no spirit. So he's trying to put that spirit back in place. But the liri functions as a point where many of the anger states, so if you hear in community, liri waru waru, or liri nyarengi, he's becoming angry or becoming raged, or liri kura, he's losing one's temper. So they use the liri as the central point of anger and anger states. And kata is kind of like the point where many of the behaviors that are kind of seen as culturally unacceptable or culturally out of the norm. So like kara kura balaya, he's doing things now in our cultural conceptualization, he's doing things outside of that boundary. So then maybe something is wrong with that guy. So we've got to bring him, find a culturally appropriate way in Ngangkari to bring him back into, thinking straight or thinking the right way again. So funny in the head, or it could just be kind of like a general, he's absent-minded, karakura. Or karapika, we had karapika here. So that could signify a headache, or it could also, mean that somebody just simply needs mental health support, karapika. But then the most kind of like the depression and anxious sort of states, or depression in terms of the Western view and understanding of it, kind of sit within that kurumba and junni areas. So they use the junni as where the subjective feelings of what is kind of like hopelessness, worthlessness, and those sort of lacking motivation. So junniwia is like lacking motivation, simply as that. Or junnikura, got a bad feeling, like a bad premonition about something is about to go wrong. And then kurumba is kind of like where the central, intimate aspects of one's identity is. So that guy was trying to get his spirit, bring it back, kurumba. And these are like, kurumba inni is like flustered, startled. Kurumba upa, like lacking motivation, but more than the general. Or kurumba waru. So that's, remember how we had liri waru, but this is like another form. This is more of a whole body rather than a liri waru. It would be more of a short-term anger, whereas kurumba waru is the many, and in terms of, if you're looking at it from a diagnostic point of view, if you were doing it from psychology, there's kind of like timelines that you have to qualify in order to get a diagnosis. So kurumba waru would be that qualification to give you that diagnosis, because that means that it's happened over a long period of time. Whereas liri waru is kind of like a short term. Whereas kurumba waru is like, this has been going on for some time. There's actually a language that exists, such as kurumba waru, juniwia, junigura, liri waru, karakura, rather than kind of like Western terms that are just introduced into the Anangu language. But there's actually, and then the body parts are the places where many describe these feelings of distress from or through.
So is it appropriate to teach senior kids
No, they not. A lot of them not. And like Juniwea is one that I see a lot on Facebook actually. Like Juniwea, which would mean like, would be the closest thing to depression sort of, or like a feeling of, worthlessness sort of in that. The closest thing to that. But obviously from a diagnostic marker point of view, you wouldn't just say, oh, Juniwea, if someone says, oh, I'm sitting down Juniwea, you wouldn't just say, oh, you're depressed. No, because what we know for depression is that you've got to have it over a longer period of time, which is that separation between Kurunba Waru and Liri Waru. Liri Waru short burst, Kurunba Waru longer period of time. For Juniwea, they could just be feeling, oh, I feel bad. But that would just be for a day. You wouldn't automatically say, oh, that person has been feeling like this for a long period of time. They must be struggling with something, but it could just be it. So the time aspect is would be probably more associated with the kurba, would be the longer period of time, because it's the more intimate aspect of the self, rather than the Juni, Liri and Kara. But Kara has also been more associated with like kind of psychosis and hearing voices and others, things like that, because it's in your head. Just thought I'd kind of from listening to some of those things, for anyone that was interested in terms of health and social emotional well-being, just throw those out there as well. Well, this year I'm doing a paper on this, so like and exploring this within the lands, within the land. So it's an extension of what I did a few years back in honours with my supervisor from UniSA, looking at just more general kind of context and ways that mental health behaviours arise, whereas this would just describe some of those feelings and longer period states of mental health. And like from an Anangu point of view, there's kind of like when you do if anyone that works in health, there's like a clinical intake sort of thing. Like someone comes to the hospital, you do an intake, see if this guy needs medical attention or psychological attention. Yeah. They come in, you do a interview, and then you decide on that. So Ngangkari do that within like the space of a couple of minutes. They usually come and say, what have you been doing, where have you been, what are you doing, how are you feeling, and then they'll be able to identify whether this is a physical illness or more of a psychological illness. But that's a very complex sort of cultural, nuanced way of doing that. Unless you are in that setting, you wouldn't be able to identify through that interaction if you weren't like Ngangkari or to be able to determine whether or not this person needs physical or not. But generally, if it's just a physical illness, they'll just say, oh, it's kind of big end, and they'll be able to describe the feeling, and then, all right, that's okay.
If someone puts Juniwea, got no feeling or something like that on Facebook, that's the kind of thing where you might actually get someone to check on them.
Yep.
That's the sort of, I need someone to get eyes on them, because if they're by themselves and feeling dissociated and whatever, it can be a moment where you need to get someone just to sort of locate them and make sure they're okay.
Yeah. Absolutely, especially if you've seen it like a number of times.
With the thinking about, again, it's not just for mental health, as you said, thinking about education, one of the things that we've been in a project to develop Anangu curriculum over the last bit over 12 months now, and it's an ongoing project, and one of the things people talk about consistently as the purpose for the Anangu curriculum is Korunpa Kunpunjaku. So it's for the strengthening of the spirit of the child. Now, you look at the purpose of public education, for example, which is a fairly new sort of set of resources that have gone out around public schools. It talks about similar kinds of things, but it doesn't use that language of strengthening the spirit of the child. But to talk about Anangu education without that core notion of what you're there to do, or what that curriculum is there to do, doesn't make a lot of sense. You're missing the mark. So part of that work, whether it's in schools, we might be talking about the same things using the Pirinpa language around well-being and student agency and all those kinds of things. But much of that will be encapsulated in this different way of thinking about how the child feels in their spirit, what they hold in their spirit, and the strength of their spirit. So education as another kind of field where that concept is really important and comes up a lot in our discussions.
Well, this, in terms of the policies and some of the kind of the funding and practices that have happened in the past, is that I know in the APY lands there was CAMS that had been there for a long time. Now their funding, something happened to it, and then they went into a fly-in, fly-out model. And then senior Anangu people that were involved with CAMS or were concerned about the similar sort of concerns that you've just raised, they were gobsmacked. They were like, what's going on with this model? It doesn't work, because we've seen in this course, relationships are so important. We work off that model first, then other things happen from that. We don't have the opportunity to build relationships as strongly with this sort of model. Can we, get funding to continue to have people on the ground so that they can be easily accessible, rather than, this fly-out model. So I think that has to come from Western policies and funding models and all of these sort of things that have to fund what Anangu want and hear Anangu legitimately, genuinely listen to Anangu and what they want and what they need, because they need the resources to be able to support. And in the short term, because you can't just fix things overnight, you've just got to work with what you've got. So then linking them into these sort of services that already exist in community that can best support them. Yeah, and this is probably more of the Western policies and all that kind of listening to Anangu. They've been saying this for years. There's newspaper articles from like 2020 and stuff when it got defunded, or the funding went down. They were on the ABC going, we need to have people on the ground here. But, the chief psychiatrist recently just went out to the lands and handed out a report, so I haven't really seen what's in there, but they're definitely going on a fly-in, fly-out model, which probably for a crisis wouldn't work.
And then for us who don't have command of the language, like I've known about this piece of information for weeks now, even the last day of term. Had I known what that meant, and had there been a service, she might be on path to recovery or getting some support. But,
Yeah.
In the absence of all of that, this person will continue to.
Yeah. And then it goes back to what Sam was saying, in terms of that trans-knowledging. To know, in order for teachers and health workers that don't have all the context of lived experience in the lands, to be able to begin to understand the the words and the concepts and the ways that Anangu express distress, that's in the field of psychology across the board in terms of what they call the settler colonial nations, so America, USA, Canada, New Zealand and Australia. There's a massive movement called the decolonising psychology movement. Now that's headed up by a group of Indigenous psychologists in Australia, Pat Dudgeon and the Australian APA, Australian Indigenous Psychologists Association. So they're saying we don't want just in words translated, we want concepts to emerge from our knowledges. So that's decolonising psychology. So coming from the ground up so that we can say, look, this, when the person says that, might be karakura or karapika, rather than, I'm just thinking wrong way.
But how do we upskill our own mob too? That's the big gap.
Yes.
Is upskilling our own mob to look after our own mob.
Yeah.
And that's a big issue. And those of you that are working on the lands and trying to provide a service for Anangu, that's a big issue. Upskilling and allowing us to take control of what's ngana mawara, ngana mawanyakurura as well.
And with CAMS, like they actually had 4 or 5 Anangu workers in the communities with them, alongside them. They were trying to at least begin the process of upskilling them, but then it just went away because of the funding.
Fabulous talk. Does the term runga fit into your schema anywhere, or just used informally?
Yeah, it's in there. It's in there. And that's more of that, karakura. It would fit more in the kara conceptualization schema you've just used. Yeah. Yeah, Moan Maulpa would be fit in there somewhere. But there has to be other words like Kurunba by itself and Upa by itself. So, well, what is it? But then you merge the two and then make it, and there's a concept there.